In this module, we are going to dive deeper into consuming SharePoint data in Silverlight. As a quick recap, in previous versions of SharePoint, there was no client object model, so we only had the server-side API for accessing data. Now that did of course include the web services, so the point is we could have created Silverlight solutions that consume SharePoint data in previous versions of SharePoint, but it wasn't a particularly easy or straightforward job. Calling SharePoint web services from Silverlight is not a particularly easy task to do, so often developers created their own client and server objects to plug the communication architecture between Silverlight and SharePoint. And although this was a very powerful approach, there was a lot of development overhead in that when you could have been concentrating on creating your actual business solutions, rather than adding a layer of architecture or infrastructure. Now with SharePoint 2010 and Silverlight, we have the client object model, and the client object model really takes away the need for you to develop your own architecture for allowing Silverlight to communicate with SharePoint. The client object model allows sites and lists and files and folders, templates and property bags, list items and security information, and content types and site collection operations, all to be available to the client. And one of the consumers of the client object model is of course Silverlight. Now the communication occurs via XML and JSON, so the client object model contacts our server with a batched list of commands to be executed and receives the results. Here's a very simple code sample that shows how easy it is to get started developing with SharePoint and Silverlight. We build the client context object, and this is the object that will initiate the communication with SharePoint, and we can start building client-side objects for lists and webs and so forth. So this block of code actually runs when the Silverlight application loads. We have a layout root loaded event, and what the code does is create and instantiate a new instance of the client context object and retrieves the URL for the initiation of the client context via the application context of the Silverlight application. Now if we assume that this is being hosted in the Silverlight web part, then we can be assured that the application context is available. We can then call load methods, and you may have seen these in previous modules with the .NET client object model. We can load the web property of the client context object, then the lists, and we can load the document library called shared documents simply by calling the getByTitle method of the lists object. We can load the documents folder, then the root folder of the documents library, and then load the collection of files within the root folder. And we'll see this in the demonstrations throughout the rest of this module. But the point really is to show how the client object model has taken away the need for you to create your own architecture for communicating between Silverlight and SharePoint.